George Harrison was never loud. He rarely raised his voice, even in tense situations, and he seldom lashed out in public. Yet within the Beatles, he carried a quiet, simmering frustration that few could see. It wasn't dramatic or public. It was personal, subtle, and persistent. Beneath his calm demeanor and spiritual pursuits, there was a man negotiating his place in a band dominated by larger personalities, and that struggle shaped much of his life and music. Early years and musical beginnings. In the early 1960s, George was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They bonded over a shared love of skiffle and rock and roll, trading records and musical ideas. McCartney was older, confident, and quick-witted, while George was quieter, more reserved, and deeply impressionable. He admired Paul's self-assuredness, and later, he would be equally captivated by John Lennon's brilliance. When George joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15. John initially thought George was too young, but Paul arranged a second audition on a bus. There, George impressed John by flawlessly playing the lead guitar line from Ranchi. That moment would open the door to what would become the Beatles, yet even from the beginning, George was entering someone else's story. Lennon and McCartney were the band's primary voices, shaping its vision and direction. George followed, learned, and absorbed their energy, content for the time with his place in the group. The quiet observer. As the Beatles rose to global fame, George became known as the Quiet Beatle. To the public, this was part of his mystique. But for those closest to him, it was more than a personality trait. It was the reflection of a man often overshadowed by his bandmates. George had musical ideas and creative impulses, but in the studio, he was sometimes overlooked. When he suggested songs or arrangements, they were often passed over or adjusted by the others, particularly Paul, whose perfectionism and assertiveness could dominate sessions. Despite these challenges, George developed patience and resilience. He observed, learned, and slowly cultivated his own voice. Still, the feeling of being sidelined, of having his contributions muted, was real, even if it was subtle. This quiet tension would follow him for years, influencing both his music and his personal relationships. Breaking point in the studio. By the late 1960s, George had grown as a songwriter, ready to claim more creative space. The White Album sessions in 1968 marked a turning point. Inside the studio, the dynamic between the band members had shifted. Paul had taken a natural leadership role, and John's attention was often elsewhere, absorbed by his personal life. George's patience was thinning. During the Let It Be sessions in early 1969, tensions came to the surface. Cameras captured a moment between George and Paul over the song Two of Us. Paul attempted to direct George's guitar part, and George, quietly but firmly, responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It was neither sarcastic nor confrontational. It was a subtle, weary statement of limits. To the outside world, it might have seemed minor, but for those in the studio, it marked years of creative frustration coming to a head. George briefly left the band, returning only after a few days under new terms, a step that allowed him the space to develop songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, showcasing the depth of his artistry when given freedom. Solo success and reflections. After the Beatles' official breakup in 1970, George's solo work gave him the creative space he had long sought. His 1971 album, All Things Must Pass, was a commercial and critical triumph. Songs that had been sidelined during his Beatles years finally found their voice. Tracks like Wah Wah conveyed his frustrations in a creative musical language, turning past challenges into enduring art. The album revealed a man who had endured years of subtle marginalization but had emerged stronger, confident, and fully himself. Legal disputes following the band's split, particularly the lawsuit initiated by Paul to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership, added tension, but George's creative output remained resilient. While his ex-wife, Patty Boyd, noted that George sometimes found Paul difficult, it was clear that he had learned to navigate these dynamics with grace. He tolerated, adapted, and ultimately transformed his experiences into meaningful music, leaving behind a legacy that spoke louder than any personal resentment could. Relationships within the band. George's relationship with John Lennon was different, but equally complex. Early on, he idolized John, seeing him not just as a bandmate, but as a mentor. Lennon encouraged his experimentation and creative growth, and George cherished that guidance. Over time, however, John became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, and George felt a sense of emotional distance. Lennon's sarcasm toward George's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality stung, highlighting the subtle ways even admiration could be intertwined with misunderstanding. Despite this, George maintained respect and fondness for John. Their bond, though strained at times, remained significant. The assassination of Lennon in 1980 shook George profoundly. His tribute through music reflected both the joy of their early collaboration and the complexity of their later estrangement. A measured, thoughtful remembrance rather than overt sentimentality, later years and quiet reconciliation. In his later years, George Harrison found balance as a solo artist, spiritual thinker, and philanthropist. He rarely spoke about the Beatles unless prompted, and when he did, his tone was reflective and often tinged with gentle irony. Asked if he missed being in the Beatles, he once replied, "Not with the others, no." A comment that revealed his nuanced feelings, acknowledgement of past struggles, tempered by a focus on his present peace. The 1994 Beatles Anthology project brought George back together with Paul and Ringo, completing unfinished songs by John. To the public, it was a reunion. Behind the scenes, old dynamics resurfaced. George maintained his composure, though he sometimes rolled his eyes at Paul's direction. Their interactions were polite but measured, a testament to years of both friendship and friction. Even as their patterns returned, they were navigated with maturity, mutual respect, and a recognition of shared history. Final years and legacy. George's final years were marked by health challenges, including a diagnosis of throat cancer in 1997. Despite illness, he remained engaged with family, friends, and his passions. Paul visited him during this time, and the two shared quiet moments of connection. Paul described sitting together holding hands, a gesture that spoke volumes, reflecting a deep, enduring bond that had evolved over decades. George passed away on November 29, 2001, at home in Los Angeles, surrounded by loved ones. His final words were simple yet profound: "Love one another." Even in death, George's life and relationships reflected both complexity and grace. While he experienced frustration, overshadowing, and occasional estrangement, he also demonstrated resilience, creativity, and the capacity for quiet forgiveness. His music and philosophy embodied a man who balanced artistic ambition with personal reflection, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire. Conclusion: George Harrison's story is one of a quiet genius navigating a world dominated by larger-than-life personalities. He experienced admiration, love, and occasional friction with his bandmates, yet he transformed every challenge into music that resonated across generations. His quiet rebellion, patience, and deep introspection shaped not only the Beatles' sound, but also the enduring spirit of his solo work. He was never the loudest Beatle, but his voice, both musical and personal, was unforgettable. Through decades of collaboration, tension, growth, and reflection, George Harrison carved out his own place in music history, showing that sometimes the most powerful statements are made in silence, patience, and the gentle insistence of being heard on one's own terms.